The king in the car park, the secrets Richard III took to his grave as his final resting place is revealed.
In 2014, scientists made a stunning announcement. DNA testing confirmed that a skeleton discovered beneath a parking lot belonged to King Richard III. But there was a twist. When researchers analyzed the Y-chromosome, the genetic line passed from father to son, something didn't add up. There was no match between Richard III and his supposed modern male line relatives. That result didn't just raise eyebrows, it hinted at a much deeper, centuries-old secret. A second test confirmed it. The Y-chromosome didn't line up at all. What did that mean? Somewhere in the royal bloodline, there had been a break, a hidden event that rewrote history itself. At the time, the public was told it was simply an unresolved mystery. But fast forward to 2026, and new findings have completely changed the picture. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or minor scandal. It suggested something far more unsettling, a hidden truth that may have shaped the legitimacy of royal power for generations. It all began with what many called the Leicester miracle. Think about it. A long-lost king, buried for over 500 years beneath an ordinary parking lot. That's where the story of Richard III seemed to end. He was the last English king to die in battle, killed in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field. His death marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and brought the Wars of the Roses to a close. His enemies, the victorious Tudors, led by Henry VII, made sure his defeat sent a message. His body was stripped and displayed publicly through the streets of Leicester. A final act of humiliation meant to signal the fall of his dynasty. Afterward, he was buried quietly in a modest grave at Greyfriars Church. And then, history erased him. Within decades during the Reformation, the church was demolished. Its stones were reused, the land repurposed, and the exact location of Richard's grave faded into obscurity. Over time, myths took over. Some claimed his bones had been dug up and thrown into the nearby River Soar. For centuries, he existed mostly as a villain, immortalized as a deformed tyrant in Shakespeare's play. That is, until one woman decided to challenge that narrative. Screenwriter Philippa Langley became fascinated with Richard, not the monster, but the man behind the legend. She believed history had been shaped by Tudor propaganda. Determined to find the truth, she spent years studying old maps, comparing medieval Leicester with the modern city. Her research led her to an unlikely place, a plain, unremarkable city council parking lot. Most people thought it was absurd, a fantasy, but she convinced the University of Leicester to investigate. In August 2012, archaeologists began digging. They cut a narrow trench through the asphalt, expecting very little. But on the very first day, they found human bones. At first, it could have been anyone. After all, this had once been a church burial ground. But as the excavation continued, the details became more compelling. The skeleton, labeled Skeleton 1, had been buried hastily in a grave that was too short, forcing the body into an awkward position. This wasn't a respectful burial. It suggested urgency, or even contempt. The remains belonged to a man in his early 30s, the same age Richard III was when he died. Then came the injuries. The bones revealed 10 wounds, 8 of them to the skull. This wasn't a clean death in battle, it was brutal and personal. One massive blow to the base of the skull, likely from a sword, would have been fatal. Another wound, possibly from a halberd, pierced through the top of the head. It painted a clear picture. The king had been surrounded, unhorsed, and killed in a violent final assault. But the most revealing detail lay in the spine. The skeleton showed a pronounced curvature, scoliosis, that developed during adolescence. For centuries, Richard had been portrayed as a grotesque hunchback. The bones told a different story. Yes, he had a spinal condition, but it wasn't the extreme deformity described in propaganda. Still, it would have caused one shoulder to sit higher than the other, matching historical descriptions surprisingly well. Further tests added more clues. Isotope analysis of his teeth showed a diet rich in seafood and wine, the kind of food reserved for someone of high status. Piece by piece, the evidence pointed in one direction. They hadn't just found a skeleton, they had found a king. But there was still one final step. To prove it beyond any doubt, scientists needed DNA evidence. And that's where things took an unexpected turn. Extracting DNA from remains over 500 years old is incredibly difficult. Time breaks it down, leaving only fragments behind. Yet somehow, from those fragments, a story began to emerge. A story that didn't just confirm an identity, but uncovered a secret buried deep within royal history itself. DNA doesn't age gracefully. Over centuries, it breaks apart, shattered into tiny fragments, like a priceless vase smashed onto concrete. And it gets worse. It's incredibly easy to contaminate. One stray hair, a single skin cell, even a sneeze from someone nearby can corrupt the sample. That's why the research team, led by geneticist Turi King, had to take extreme precautions. They worked inside sterile clean rooms, dressed head to toe in protective suits, more like astronauts than scientists. To extract the best preserved DNA, they carefully drilled into two key areas, a tooth and the femur, the dense thigh bone. These spots act like natural vaults, protecting genetic material from time and the elements. Their mission was straightforward: find a living relative and see if the DNA matched. Here's where things get interesting. Most of our DNA, the kind that determines traits like height or eye color, gets mixed up every generation. It's reshuffled between both parents, making it nearly useless for tracing a direct line through history. But there are two special exceptions. The first is mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. This type of DNA is passed down only from mother to child. Fathers don't pass it on at all. That means your mtDNA is essentially identical to your mother's, and hers to her mother's, forming an unbroken chain that can stretch back thousands of years. It's like a biological signature of the maternal line. Now, Richard III had no surviving heirs. His only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, died young. But Richard did have an older sister, Anne of York, and that's where the investigation turned. A team of genealogists, led by historian John Ashdown Hill, took on an extraordinary challenge. They traced Anne of York's maternal line forward, generation by generation, across more than 500 years. 17 generations later, they identified two living descendants. One was Michael Ibsen, a furniture maker living in London. The other was Wendy Duldig, a distant relative. Both agreed to provide DNA samples, a simple cheek swab, for a question that had lasted centuries. Back in the lab, scientists began the delicate process of reconstructing the ancient mtDNA from the skeleton. They had to isolate it, clean out contamination, and piece together the fragments like a genetic puzzle. Then came the moment of truth. They compared the ancient DNA to the modern samples, and the result? A perfect match. The mtDNA from the skeleton was identical to Michael Ibsen's. Even more compelling, they shared a rare genetic group, haplogroup J, found in only a small percentage of Europeans. The chances of this being coincidence were incredibly low. Combined with the archaeological evidence, the age, the battle wounds, the scoliosis, the conclusion became undeniable. In February 2013, the University of Leicester confirmed it. The skeleton found beneath that parking lot was, beyond reasonable doubt, King Richard III. The mystery was solved. The world celebrated. But the scientists weren't finished yet. There was one more test to run, and this one would change everything. The second type of special DNA is the Y-chromosome. Unlike mtDNA, which follows the maternal line, the Y-chromosome passes strictly from father to son. It's a genetic marker of the paternal line, a signature of male ancestry. In theory, Richard III's Y-chromosome should match that of modern men descended from his male line ancestors. To test this, researchers tracked down living descendants of Henry Somerset, 5th Duke of Beaufort. These men could trace their lineage directly back to Edward III, Richard's great-great-grandfather. If their Y chromosomes matched, it would be the final piece of proof. The samples were collected, the data was analyzed, and the results came in. A complete mismatch. Not close, not partial, total failure to match. This wasn't a minor discrepancy. It meant one thing. Somewhere across the 19 generations separating Richard III from these modern descendants, the paternal line had been broken. At some point in history, a child had been born, whose biological father was not the man recorded in the royal lineage. In scientific terms, it's called a false paternity event. In plain language, a hidden scandal. The DNA didn't just reveal identity, it exposed a lie buried deep in royal history. But the biggest question remained: where did it happen? The Y chromosome results sent shockwaves through historians. This wasn't just an oddity, it was a genetic contradiction of the official royal family tree. And the implications were massive, because the entire legitimacy of the Plantagenet dynasty depended on an unbroken father-to-son bloodline. That lineage was the foundation of their claim to the English throne, the very reason wars were fought, alliances were forged, and kings rose and fell during the Wars of the Roses. If that bloodline wasn't what history claimed it to be, then the story of royal power itself might not be what we've always believed. This wasn't just a scientific discovery, it was a direct hit to the very idea of royal legitimacy. DNA had just revealed that the bloodline, the foundation of power, authority, and divine right, might not have been pure at all. And the most shocking part, at some point in history, a noblewoman had a child with someone other than her husband, and that child was raised as the rightful heir, a single hidden moment that may have quietly reshaped the course of English history. So where did the break happen? That became the million-dollar question. Here's where things start to get complicated. The 2014 study, published in Nature Communications, was groundbreaking from a scientific standpoint. But when it came to this explosive revelation, the researchers, led by Turi King, were extremely cautious, maybe too cautious. They presented two possible explanations. The break in the Y chromosome happened after Richard III. In other words, somewhere along the 500-year line of the Somerset family, the modern descendants, there was a disruption. This was the safe explanation. It would mean Richard himself was legitimate, and the issue came later. Just a minor scandal buried somewhere in noble genealogy. Interesting, sure, but not history-shattering. The break occurred before Richard III, and this changed everything. Because if true, it meant Richard, along with his brother, Edward IV, might not have been the biological sons of their recorded father. Let that sink in. If that were the case, Richard III had no true hereditary claim to the throne he fought and died for. And it didn't stop there. It would also mean Edward IV, the father of the famous princes in the Tower, was technically illegitimate, which leads to a staggering conclusion. The entire Wars of the Roses, a brutal, decades-long conflict over rightful rule, may have been fought over a bloodline that wasn't even real. The House of York's claim to the throne would collapse completely. Back in 2014, the research team treated both possibilities as equally likely. They admitted they couldn't pinpoint where the break happened. The technology simply wasn't advanced enough to determine which Y chromosome represented the true Plantagenet line. And by staying cautious, they softened the impact. They buried the most explosive part of the story. So what did the world focus on? The headline, "We found the king." Meanwhile, the Y chromosome mismatch, arguably the bigger revelation, was pushed aside as an unsolved curiosity, a strange footnote, too controversial to fully confront, because the implications were enormous. It didn't just question one king, it cast doubt on entire dynasties, including the Yorks, and even the Tudors who followed. Here's the irony. Modern science didn't just confirm Richard's identity, it also challenged his legitimacy by the very rules he lived and died by. And here's another layer to consider. These so-called false paternity events aren't actually that rare. Modern genetic studies estimate they occur in about 1 to 2% of births per generation. Over 19 generations, roughly 500 years, the chances of at least one such event happening become extremely high. But this wasn't just any family. This was royalty, where bloodline wasn't just important, it was everything. And the irony becomes almost poetic. Richard III's own claim to the throne partly rested on declaring his nephews, the princes in the Tower, illegitimate. Yet centuries later, his own DNA suggests the entire concept of legitimate blood may have been flawed from the beginning. For nearly a decade, that's where the story stayed. Unresolved, a historical mystery frozen in time. Until 2026, a new team of researchers at the University of Leicester, working alongside experts from Harvard and the Max Planck Institute, launched a bold new project, the Royal Bloodline Genomic Reanalysis. This time, they weren't just confirming identity, they were going to find the break. And the technology they brought with them, light years ahead of what existed in 2014. They used long-read DNA sequencing, capable of analyzing large continuous strands of genetic code instead of tiny fragments. They combined it with proteomics, studying ancient proteins preserved in bone, and epigenetic mapping, revealing biological traits shaped during a person's lifetime. But to solve the mystery, they needed more data. They already had two pieces of the puzzle. Richard III's Y chromosome, the modern Somerset family's Y chromosome, and they didn't match. The question was, which one was the real Plantagenet line? To answer that, the team needed a control sample, someone unquestionably part of the original lineage. They turned to John of Gaunt, a son of Edward III and a key figure in the royal family tree. Crucially, he lived before the suspected break could have occurred. His DNA would act as the ultimate reference point. With permission from Westminster Abbey, researchers took a microscopic sample from his tomb. At the same time, they conducted a deeper genetic analysis of the modern Somerset line, tracing their Y chromosome back generation by generation, searching for any sign of disruption. Then the results came in, and they were explosive. First, the Somerset lineage. The data showed, with 99.9% certainty, that their Y chromosome had remained intact for centuries. No break, no anomaly. This effectively ruled out the safe explanation. Then came the critical test. The DNA from John of Gaunt was compared, and it matched the Somersets perfectly. That was it, the smoking gun. It proved that the Somerset line carried the true Plantagenet Y chromosome, which meant the mismatch wasn't on their side. It was on Richard III's. The break in the bloodline had to exist within his immediate ancestry. And according to the 2026 findings, it most likely occurred between his grandfather, Richard of Conisbrough, and Richard himself. Suddenly, all eyes turned to one figure. Richard, Duke of York, Richard III's father, and just like that, a 500-year-old mystery was no longer a mystery. It was a revelation, a scandal hidden in plain sight, finally brought to light by the one thing that can't lie, DNA. Suddenly, that centuries-old rumor didn't sound so ridiculous anymore. During the Wars of the Roses, rivals of the York family spread a damaging story. They claimed that Richard, Duke of York, wasn't actually the son of Richard of Conisbrough. According to the rumor, his mother, Cecily Neville, had an affair while her husband was away at war. They even pointed fingers at a supposed father, a charming English archer known as Blayborn. At the time, it was brushed off as political trash talk, just another attempt to weaken the Yorkist claim. But now, the 2026 DNA findings suggest that story might actually be true. Let that sink in. The very man who ignited the Wars of the Roses by claiming a superior bloodline may not have had a legitimate claim himself. This doesn't just tweak a detail in history, it flips the entire narrative upside down. All right, let's break this down in simple terms. No complicated academic language, just real talk. If you're watching this, you're probably asking the same questions. Is this legit? Is it speculation? Did this just suddenly appear out of nowhere? Or is it another internet conspiracy? Here's the reality. This is not speculation anymore. That's the unsettling part. The 2026 study didn't offer a theory. It didn't suggest a possibility. It delivered cold, hard genetic evidence. This is the version of the story that couldn't be ignored. Back in 2014, when Richard III was identified, scientists mentioned a small complication, a break in the Y chromosome line, but they softened it. They presented it like a minor genealogical hiccup, something that could have happened anywhere across 19 generations. It sounded harmless, manageable, but the 2026 analysis? This was the unfiltered version. No softening, no hedging. All we know is who it wasn't. Now think about the consequences. If the Duke of York had no legitimate claim, what does that mean for his children? It means Edward IV, the charismatic warrior king who seized the throne, had zero genetic right to rule. It means his sons, the tragic princes in the Tower, were never legitimate heirs in the first place. And it means Richard III himself, who took the crown by declaring those princes illegitimate, was standing on the same shaky ground. The entire House of York, built on a lie. And that leads to an even darker realization. The Wars of the Roses, a 30-year conflict that tore England apart, may have been fought over nothing. Tens of thousands died. Noble families were wiped out. Battles like Battle of Towton turned fields into mass graves in a single day, all for a claim to the throne that may never have been valid to begin with. That's the part the 2014 study quietly stepped around. Because this wasn't just a break in the line. This was the break, the one that mattered most, the one that pulls apart an entire dynasty. And now, with the 2026 findings, the story doesn't end. It actually gets even more unsettling. Because now, historians are asking questions that once sounded absurd, but suddenly don't. What if Cecily Neville knew the truth? What if she was fully aware her son wasn't legitimate? The timeline raises eyebrows. Her husband was away on campaign, and yet she gave birth to a healthy child at a very convenient moment. Was it coincidence? Or something planned? There's even a more extreme theory, once dismissed outright, now gaining attention. What if the child wasn't hers at all? What if, in a desperate move to protect her family's power, she secretly replaced her baby with another? A child from a servant or a local family, raised as her own. In that version of events, Cecily Neville. She becomes something else entirely, a strategist, a survivor, someone playing the ultimate game of power. Centuries before, it had a name. And it doesn't stop there. What if Edward IV himself suspected the truth? What if deep down, he knew his claim was fragile? Remember, his brother Richard III later argued that Edward had made a secret marriage agreement with Eleanor Butler before marrying Elizabeth Woodville. That claim was used to declare Edward's children illegitimate, giving Richard the legal grounds to take the throne. But now, with everything we've learned, you have to wonder, was that just political strategy, or was it something deeper? Because when DNA starts rewriting history like this, it doesn't just answer questions, it creates new ones, bigger ones, more unsettling ones. And the scariest part? We may never know where the truth ends and where the story we've been told for 500 years begins. For centuries, people believed it was nothing more than a vicious rumor, a piece of political propaganda spread by Richard III to justify taking the throne. But what if it wasn't a lie at all? What if there was truth behind it? Think about this for a second. What if Edward IV knew his own bloodline was questionable? What if deep down he understood that his claim to the throne wasn't as solid as everyone believed? That would change everything. What if his actions, his alliances, his marriages weren't random at all? What if he was deliberately trying to strengthen his position by connecting himself to families with undeniable legitimacy? Not out of ambition alone, but out of fear. And that famous pre-contract story involving Eleanor Butler. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if it was part of a larger plan that simply didn't work out? Suddenly, Edward's entire reign looks different. What if it was all a carefully crafted performance, a way to distract people from asking dangerous questions about his origins? In this version of events, Richard III didn't invent the pre-contract accusation. He exposed something that may have already been known within the family, a secret hiding in plain sight. And that leads us to the darkest and most unsettling theory of all, the mystery of the princes in the tower. We know Richard took the crown. We know his nephews were confined and then disappeared. The usual explanation? Power, simple ambition. But what if it wasn't that simple? What if it was something far more complicated and far more disturbing? Imagine this scenario. Richard isn't the villain history paints him to be. He's the loyal younger brother, the serious one, the believer. He trusts his family. He believes in the House of York. He believes in his father's right to rule. He would have seen them as proof, living proof, of a dynasty built on falsehood. And in that mindset, his actions, however extreme, become part of a warped logic. Not just taking power, but trying to reset history itself. If that's even partially true, then the DNA revelations don't just rewrite history, they reshape how we understand one of its most controversial figures. So now we're left with a final question. If the bloodline itself was compromised, what does that mean for everything that came after?